as I think. All right, we're live. Hi, how you doing? My name is Matt Cedillo. I am the literary director of the Dawes Center for the Arts. The Dawes Center for the Arts is a not-for-profit organization dedicated towards enhancing the community through the arts, through appreciation of the arts and development of the arts, and inviting people into to develop their skills and live out their dreams. So that is what we do at the Dawes Center for the Arts, and we are very, very proud to present the first in our speaker series. We're joined by the legendary historian, Dr. Paul Ortiz, author of many books and many lives. He's an incredible not only scholar but organizer and just general man of good. So we're really honored to have him here with us today. Um, uh, Dr. Ortiz, for those who are not familiar with your work, can you speak a little bit to where you are at now and some of the where what do you do over the University of Florida?
Yeah. Well, Matt, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the program, and thank you to the Arts Center for sponsoring the series. Um, you and I have known each other for many years now. I want to give you a shout out at the beginning. You have written this wonderful book, Mowing Leaves of Grass, which everyone should read if they don't already have it. So it's just a great honor to be here with you. So currently, Matt, I'm a professor of history at the University of Florida, and I'm actually speaking to you all live in Gainesville, Florida. We're on, social distancing, remote teaching, everything. I also direct the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and we were very lucky a few years ago to be able to bring Matt Cedillo down to Gainesville to do some radical poetry workshops. And I'm very happy to say, Matt, that several of our students who did those poetry workshops with you continue to do poetry, continue to rhyme. I've been in contact with them periodically over the last few years. So, you've made a big impact on us, our students in Florida, in terms of the arts. So I came to the Academy from kind of a non-traditional background. I'm a Chicano third generation military veteran, first generation college graduate. I was actually born in 1964. I grew up mainly in a shipyard town called Bremerton, Washington, and other military towns. My parents got divorced a couple times. Very working class background. People that grew up in my neighborhoods were not supposed to go to college. We went into the military. And so I actually served in combat in Central America in the mid 1980s in Special Forces, 82nd Airborne Division. And that part of my autobiography, is very similar to, as you know, a lot of Chicano scholars who are ironically, our entry into the academy was through military service because, our parents didn't have resources because they had been disenfranchised by, colonialism and the processes that Professor Rudy Acuna talks about in Occupied America, in other books. So I kind of took a roundabout way into the academy, but when I got in, I was interested in thinking about how to undermine capitalism, really from the outset, and how to challenge U.S. empire, because after all, I'd been a soldier of U.S. empire in Central America, and I'd seen the devastating impacts of capitalism abroad. And you have to remember, when I went overseas in 1984, U.S. capitalism was already in a period of long decline. And yet there still was something of a middle class in the United States, albeit only supported by the exploitation of workers in Mexico and the global South and Asia and other places. Now, 30 some years later, even those privileged enclaves in the United States of middle class life have been shrinking. Through your mentor, Luis Rodriguez, the wonderful book he wrote, Music of the Mill, that talks about these generations of Chicano steelworkers, right? Factory workers that were able to get just a tiny foothold, a toehold, if you will, in the door of the American dream by being factory workers. Although, like in my father's case, it took a lot out of their physical, and emotional health. Now, most of those factories are shut down, and capital is going after these last remaining sectors of working class employment for Latinx, Chicanos, African American people. A good example, Matt, you asked me to kind of think about the situation we're in now. It's no accident that Wall Street and their stooge in the White House, Donald Trump, is going after the U.S. Postal Service. Why go after the U.S. Postal Service at this point in time? Well, a few reasons. One is because the U.S. Postal Service contains so many workers of color. Well over 10% of postal workers are Latino workers or define themselves as Hispanics. Over 20% African American, a growing number of Asian American workers. They're unionized too, which means that they're able to, as we say, I'm a union member myself, we are allowed to negotiate the degree of our exploitation, which is a little better than just being exploited, right? And so it's no surprise that Wall Street would use the global pandemic to wage a frontal assault against the Postal Service because they want to undermine those fairly well-paying jobs that many of our people have and transform the Postal Service into a kind of a Jeff Bezos-like warehouse kind of sweatshop situation.
Yeah. So as a historian, how would you compare this to the response to the local government and national government during or federal government during in response to the response to Katrina a decade or so ago?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a really good question, Matt. I mean, in terms of, how does the federal state responses compare with the federal state response to Hurricane Katrina? Maybe even a Great Recession, 2008, maybe even Great Depression, the 1930s. One of the big differences is that we have made some gains, I think, in terms of social movements and struggles. Capital realizes that it cannot treat us in the same exact way it treated us in the 1930s or even in Hurricane Katrina. There's too much anger, there's too much mobilization. And so at least part of the initial response has been to say that, hey, let's try to become Keynesians again. This is kind of a trip. I know you've been doing an extensive interview series with a really outstanding Marxist intellectual. Back in the day, back in the 30s, there was this statement, we're all Keynesians now, referring to the economist John Maynard Keynes. What that referred to was that federal and state governments in the United States, but in different parts of the world, realized that to keep the economy going, you had to engage in what was called demand-side economics. In other words, to keep the economy going, Franklin Roosevelt said, I've got to put money in the pockets of people like Matt Cedillo or Paul Ortiz, and then they're going to go out and spend those dollars at Macy's or Penny's or Sears, and that's going to help bring the economy up, right? In the 80s, there was a revolution. It was called the Reagan Revolution. And the idea behind the Reagan Revolution was supply side economics. Take the money away from Matt and Paul, put it in the hands of Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. And then they will decide how to distribute those resources. And we've been living with the era of supply side economics for decades now. So I think the big difference is that there is at least a gesture in these puny $1,200 checks, which we can't. On the one hand, I call them puny, but on the other hand, it's a lifeline for people. So we don't want to belittle those. But on the other hand, why are hedge fund managers also being eligible for small business loans, literally small business grants? So that's one. That's kind of the cheery side, right, of the most rosiest of kind of optimistic side that I can provide. The negative side, we still have the hammer. We still have over policing in our communities. We still have millions of people locked up or in conditions of semi-servitude. In my county, for example, Alachua County, we've been trying to get our county sheriff and the prosecutor to let nonviolent offenders, alleged offenders, out of the prison system. Because of the pandemic, we have been completely unsuccessful. They've really set their hearts against releasing any prisoners. As you can imagine, There are a lot of people in Alachua County. It's Florida. A lot of people locked up now. And so we've actually created a Kickstarter to try to raise bail money to try to get people accused of nonviolent offenses out of the prison system where they're really at risk for getting the virus. So, there's the hammer, there's the nailed fist, there's the velvet glove, I don't, whatever kind of metaphors you want to engage in. But it's really all of the above. And there's also a lot of uncertainty. And I also think, and this Matt gets back to your discussion on Marxism that you've been having. Marx was very attentive, and then a lot of the leading Marxists of the 20th century, people like C.L.R. James, were really urged us to look at capital and the ruling class. And in America, by the way, in the U.S., we have a ruling class. And I know this is kind of jarring for people to hear, but let's admit it. We have an oligarchy. We have a ruling class, right? Once we admit that, then we can begin to deal with our problems in a forthright manner. But our ruling class right now, I would argue, there's fractures. There's tensions between them, right? There's differences, and kind of learning some of those differences, I think, is important. So I'm sorry I kind of started rambling in response to
No.
but I would, but I would also connect Hurricane Katrina to what we're having now. I mean, in the South, in the Gulf South, Hurricane Katrina, of course, hit the Gulf South and Florida, New Orleans, of course, especially hard. We've never quite recovered from the displacement of Hurricane Katrina. What I mean by this is that my family, my father's family, grew up in Houston, Texas, and we still have a lot of people in Houston. And the people pushed out of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and all the gentrification, some of them were quote unquote relocated into working class neighborhoods in Houston, and are still struggling. So yeah, it's really in many ways a continuation of the neoliberal nightmare that we've been trying to grapple with.
Right, and leading into Hurricane Katrina, many developers in New Orleans were looking to make, we're looking to still rely on a tourism industry, but also, move low-income renters and other people out so that they could, maximize their profit and essentially have, New Orleans become like Disney World, like New Orleans World, right? And so, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, a lot of people have not been able to move back, and that has been something that's happened. So I kind of have the same kind of fears that when there are massive evictions that are going to come up this next month, in many different parts of the country that are facing gentrification, those changes that will occur now will be made permanent. Capital big and small, or capital medium and small, I mean big and medium, are going to take advantage of this moment to really do the things that they would want to do that they couldn't do in normal times. I mean, I think it's a two-way street. I think that there's a lot of reforms that are happening now so that to keep people alive to exploit them later. You know what I'm saying? Like, the Keynesian kind of thing. Like, we keep these people alive so that we can like work them later, right? A lot of that's going on, and I think from a working class perspective, whatever reforms are made now, we have to demand to be made permanent. But I also think that the landlords and business developers and the people that go into neighborhoods and try to like flip houses and create businesses and do all that kind of stuff, like those venture capitals essentially, um, they're gonna, whatever they can grab a hold of in this moment, when in this crisis, they're gonna try and make sure become permanent changes as well. I mean, and when I look at Katrina, I see a clear model for how they might do that, but not just in one city, but throughout the whole country.
Exactly. Well, Matt, and that's one of the things that's really been exciting in Florida and some other parts of the country I've been able to follow through friends. People are beginning to come together to resist eviction. And that movement was already well underway when a lot of the governors and mayors began to call, temporary moratoriums on evictions. Um, if you were kind of a middle class person, you may have saw that as, oh, this is kind of an example of us all pulling together. My take on it was that if you're a mayor and you're really paying attention to what's happening in your town, you're realizing that people are beginning to mobilize to resist eviction.
Yeah.
That in itself could really jeopardize existing property relations. It's also, by the way, one of the first most important insurrectionary activities that happened in the United States in the opening moments of the Great Depression. And this is one of the things that really scared the bejesus out of people like Franklin Roosevelt. You know, it was one thing for workers to go on strike in Flint, Michigan, but you know, when like farmers in the Midwest began banding together, getting their shotguns and confronting sheriffs trying to evict their neighbors, you know, that's when the state really trembled in the early 1930s, and that was a really key part of why the New Deal happened. I think right now, I mean, what I've been telling people is we have, I mean, I hate to use this term opportunity because right now there's a lot of oppression, a lot of exploitation. But in many ways, these ideas of moratoriums on evictions, you know, national health care, 15 in a union. I mean, just imagine this. I mean, a few weeks ago, people were debasing and trashing, you know, cashiers and service workers and maintenance workers and saying, you know, especially if they're black and brown people, oh, if they don't like it, they can just get another job or they can just leave. If you don't like it, move to Cuba, right? That's what I always say in Florida, right? Um, Now the shoe's on the other foot. Now I have witnessed affluent Anglo individuals. I still refer to them as Anglos. I grew up with that kind of language.
Yeah.
Um, I've seen affluent Anglo individuals almost begging a cashier, a service worker for assistance, for help. And so, in many ways, the shoe's on the other foot. And this is where we have an opening, I feel, on the left for those of us who think of ourselves as radicals to begin organizing for a different kind of world. It could be our moment.
Yeah. You mentioned Cuba. It's very interesting to see how um, again, I mean, I keep going back to Katrina, but you know, how the Cubans offered assistance as well as Venezuela during that period of time, and how that was treated. But it's interesting to look at how what's going on right now with Cuba sending doctors around the world. I mean, imagine having a healthcare system that is so well staffed that you have so many doctors per capita that even in a moment of global pandemic, you're still able to send your doctors out throughout the world. I mean, that's pretty incredible, real feat they achieved.
The U.S., unfortunately, Matt, we have. I hate to say this, but many of us, because we grew up and have lived with empire so long, we've taken for granted the idea that the way that the U.S. brings human rights to other countries is through bomb
Mm.
and war, right? And the idea that you liberate people through a violent occupation or a coup, such as the U.S. sponsored Honduras in 2009. And so when we see examples of nations like Cuba or South Korea is another great example of a small nation helping a lot of big nations right now. So you have Cuba and South Korea. It's interesting. I kind of think about them in some ways as mirror images in certain senses, although obviously they're very different types of countries. But I've seen a lot of people denigrate in the U.S., Cuba, and South Korea, and to say, oh, you know, what could they do to help other countries? And I'm like, well, yeah, they're actually saving the world right now. I mean, those Cuban medical teams, the fact that South Korea, I think, just sent, I just heard this morning, like 600,000 masks to the United States. Now, unfortunately, who knows? Maybe Trump will intercept those. I don't know. But it's an example of small nations who are really stepping up and doing things that the larger nations, you know, should have been doing a long time ago.
Yeah. You know, we talk about nations here in the state of California. Um, Gavin Newsom has been dropping this phrase, the nation state of California. And you know, when a governor speaks like that, that's not a slip of the tongue. But not getting too much into that just yet, because that's a developing thing. It is interesting to see how this country is run. That there's really, it kind of already is a bunch of different little nations. I mean, the states have so much state authority. There's so much variation between places. And you now are in the state of Florida, where the governor and with the blessing of Donald Trump, I suppose, has declared that WWE are essential workers and that they're gonna reopen. And there's there's a number of absurd things happening.
Big time wrestling, yeah, essential, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a number of absurd things, and it's kind of interesting that Donald Trump kind of runs the country very similar to Vince McMahon running the WWE with putting his his daughter and his son-in-law in charge. That's very similar patterns there. But the relationship between Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump, there's aspects that are kind of funny, but there's a lot of really terrifying things that are going on there. Can you speak to
Yeah.
tell us listening here what's
Well,
going on?
Matt, I'm glad you raised this. We talked earlier about how, we have a ruling class in the U.S., but there's important fractures. So obviously, Governor Newsom is part of that ruling class.
Mm.
Ron DeSantis is part of that ruling class. But they're very, very different. California is very different than Florida. And what I see happening in Florida is kind of a nightmarish uh, marriage, if you will, between like old, Governor Wallace, Jim Crow racists in Alabama, and dictator Batista, the last dictator of Cuba. It's almost like Batista and Wallace coming together today in Florida. That's kind of the negative view. So DeSantis was not the person who was supposed to be the governor right now. The guy who originally was supposed to be the Republican governor, who was kind of handpicked by the Republican establishment, was pushed to the wayside by Donald Trump. And Trump made it clear that he wanted DeSantis to be like his man in Tallahassee, our state capital, from day one. And why is that? Because Trump has staked out Florida as his dynasty. He's moved permanently to Florida. Some people said that was because of tax evasion from New York, and that's probably part of it. But to be honest with you, Matt, we have a lot of reactionary forces throughout the state of Florida that have opened the state wide open to Donald Trump. We have a kind of a collaboration, if you will, between capital exploitation at home, low wage work, service economy, tourism, highly exploited, oppressed agricultural workers, an enormous prison industrial complex, including detention centers for a lot of so-called undocumented workers. We have the kind of at one point, the fading Miami, right-wing empire, which in some ways is actually under a lot of attack by like younger, more radical people. But so Trump finds Florida as being a very welcome place for him. He doesn't see the grassroots struggles happening though in the county. See, on the local level, what's happening in places like Miami-Dade or Broward or Alachua, where I live, or even Gaston County in the Panhandle, is that we're actually fighting and winning some local struggles. Like we've been able to get some higher minimum wage ordinances, some wage theft ordinances through. But then, of course, we have ALEC, the American Legislative Executive people coming in. We have the Koch brothers who have figured out that we're winning some battles on the county level, and now they're trying to get the state of Florida to pass preemption bills to prevent us from making it easier to unionize or giving a higher wage locally. So it's a constant struggle, But I think the example you started us with, Matt, California and Florida, Newsom and DeSantis, these are important starting points to really begin an analysis of what's happening now to capitalism and what we might do to think about, how to confront the problems that we're faced with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, your latest book was an African American and Latinx history of the United States. I would like to talk a little bit about your newest book, but first, as a historian, we you see the current moment, and you can look back and figure out, well, where does this, why is this? Why are the things? Why does the world look the way it does when I look at my window? Right? You have a deeper insight to this than many of us do, and you have something to offer here. Um, we see throughout the Midwest that the number of deaths that have been associated with the coronavirus have been disproportionately African American, widely disproportionately African American. Um, I think in the city of St. Louis, almost all people who've died have been black. And St. Louis, there's a large black population, but for every single person, that's pretty astounding when you see similar situations in Detroit and Chicago and through much of the Midwest. In New York, you see a situation New York's the most highly impacted city in our country so far, and you see widely disproportionately Latinx and African Americans have suffered under this. I think the number one part of the city that has been impacted is something like 40% Latinx, and the number two is like 64%. So again, these are impacting people um, from these backgrounds. You also see a situation where they've done some study where only it's like 84% of Latinx people are incapable of working out of the house. I mean, they don't have jobs. Where only 16% of them are going to be able to work from home, and some like 20% of African Americans will be able to work from home. So these are people who are in these jobs that just do not allow um, the ability, the luxury, the privilege of doing what you and I are doing right now. The majority of our communities. So why is that? Why is that? Why are we why do we see these communities
Well, one of
belong?
the things, Matt, you had asked me this question before we went on the air, and so, one of the things that I'm always amazed, most Americans don't realize what a small percentage of the population Latinos and African Americans compose. Whenever there's a survey done and people are asked to guess what percentage our peoples compose the total population of the U.S., the estimates are wildly overblown. African Americans only constitute 12.1% of the entire population of the U.S. So-called Hispanics only compose 16.7% of the population. The statistics that you've just given us, though, demonstrate the horrors of capitalism. And think about the term over-policing. Every neighborhood you're talking about, Matt, is a neighborhood that can be characterized as a neighborhood which is highly over-policed. That is, there are probably more cops per capita in that neighborhood than there are grocery store clerks. Chances are there aren't any grocery store clerks. Chances are there are no medical care clinics other than subsidized nonprofit clinics, right? But I can guarantee you, in all of those neighborhoods, there are police precincts, jails, prisons. That is the hammer hand of the state. But then there are also food deserts as well. You look at St. Louis, a major food desert, for a lot of working class Latinos and African Americans. So the fact that those populations are hit much harder, and the kind of work that we do, you know, uh, Chicanos, Latinos, African Americans, we're working class people. We always have been, we always will be, and that's the role that we have fulfilled within racial capitalism for the past 5 centuries. And even postal workers, getting back to that, the U.S. Postal Service and the government's. I mean, people have asked me, what can we do now to kind of fight back? Well, one of my number one things is, hey, buy stamps, like do something to keep the postal service in operation, right? But those workers, think about what it means to be a postal worker, or to be a UPS worker, or to have to work in an Amazon warehouse. There's a lot of black and brown people in those warehouses, and it's no surprise that that's also the site of a lot of labor insurgencies, a lot of wildcat strikes, a lot of people walking out, protesting because of lack of safety gear. And I also think, Matt, of these really poignant, powerful photographs. I mean, this is a time for art. This is a time for poetry. This is a time for expression. I mean, I'm seeing these photographs of that people are taking and putting on Facebook of crowded subway trains, buses, black and brown and Asian, poor white working people like on their way to work because they can't do what I can do as a university professor. I can teach my courses remotely, right? I can do it from my home. But if I'm a postal worker, if I'm an Amazon warehouse worker, if I'm a farm worker, and farm workers have been hit horrifically here in the state of Florida. I so within what we call racial capitalism, and I want us to kind of think about that term for a moment. Cedric Robinson, one of the great founders of Black Studies, wrote a wonderful book called Black Marxism, and I highly, highly suggest it for your viewers, Matt, and also your viewers who've been watching your outstanding series on Marxism. Because in Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson talks about why it is that people of color, were overdetermined in terms of the lowest wage, most dangerous types of occupations, the people most at risk for contracting the virus. It's part of the system. It's how the system works.
Yeah, no, that's and that is the bottom line. The bottom line is the bottom line. So as we've talked a little bit about you mentioned other historians. You mentioned Rudy Acuna. You've mentioned Cedric Ramos just now. You've mentioned a number of wonderful historians. Can you speak to the role you see yourself holding and the role you see in general of the historian? What should historians be doing as not just as people who are just chronicling things that happened, but as people who devote their life to looking back and looking forward? What should the historian be doing? What is the role and responsibility of the historian?
It's a critical question, Matt. I mean, I think of, I've mentioned a few of my role models, but, also people like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who, the wonderful writer of an indigenous people's history of the United States. I think if you look at Roxanne's work, and work of people like Angela Davis, Howard Zinn, what a historian I think should be doing now is providing an analysis of the system and trying to be as sober and as clear-headed as possible, not pulling any punches. Um, and at the same time, as a social movement historian, and I really, especially learned this from people like Charles Payne, a social movement historian should be trying to remind us that in the midst of all of the pain and dislocation and sorrow and oppression, that there are opportunities and that people who have been marginalized or distressed or oppressed in the past have found ways to organize and to shake the system up. And one of the things I think also as, whether you're a Marxist or an anarchist or a liberal or a trade unionist or whatever, is remembering how it is that we create, coalitions to overturn the system. And one example that I give, you mentioned Hurricane Katrina. That's a really important point of comparison. And I also think that the organizing that happened there on the ground was really important in terms of pointing out what was going to happen. I think of now the work of people like Justin Hosby, Professor Justin Hosby, who you might have on a future program. Justin grew up in New Orleans. He did a wonderful kind of radical ethnography of the school system in New Orleans. And he unpacked how capital used Hurricane Katrina to privatize the school system, the public school system in New Orleans. In other words, the 1% sees these moments of crisis, whether it's the pandemic or Hurricane Katrina or the global Great Depression of the 30s or the Great Recession of 2008. See, here's the thing: the ruling class sees these moments of crisis as moments of opportunity, and they are already moving decisively to try to augment their power. You see it in the $2 trillion so-called stimulus bill. So yeah, we got the $1,200 checks. Universities have gotten some relief. Schools have gotten some relief. But man, hedge fund managers, I'm going to tell you, Matt, if you unpack that bill, you're going to get pissed off because the 1% is made out again like thieves, like the thieves they really are. They take our surplus labor and then they turn around and use it against us to try to really destroy us. But getting back to your question, as what do we do as a historian? Is we think, one of the things I think now is to remind ourselves about these crisis moments. Let's think about 1931, 1932. The world is in a global depression. It's not just US based. People across the world are suffering. The forces of reaction are using it as a moment of opportunity. They seize Italy. They seize Germany. Great industrialists take power in Germany, and they have this maniac, Adolf Hitler, who they think they can control, but who in the end, he outfoxes all of them. and really brings the world to global warfare. The U.S. at the same time, in other countries, the U.S. could have went to full fascism in the 30s, and there was fascism in the U.S. I mean, there's the Jim Crow system. It could have even been worse. I mean, but basically, people organized in such a way in the South, in the North, and the West that we ended up with, industrial unionism. We ended up with Social Security. We ended up with, a leaky social welfare state. But hell, it could have been full fascism. I mean, I'll just be honest with you. The most powerful industrialist of the United States in the 1930s was Henry Ford. And Henry Ford was a raving anti-Semite. He was a raving racist. He was a man who loved Adolf Hitler. If Henry Ford could have taken the power in the 1930s, you and I would be having a very different discussion right now.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it gets back to your question, Matt, what can we do as historians? I think one of the things we do is what's that old phrase? I always forget it. Optimism of the will. Uh,
Pessimism of some and optimism of the will.
right. So historians are both, my students hate when they ask me a simple question and I'll say, well, it's kind of complex. And they'll say, you're always using that term. Why do you use that term complex, But I also think, and Matt, I want to wrap up that question by getting back to Roxanne's work, Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. If there's one book I want people to read right now, it is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. Because I want us to understand when we talk about pandemics, when we talk about exploitation, when we talk about expropriation, you've got to go back to the beginning. These are all the things that the United States, North America, and imperialism has been based and built upon. So the types of evils that we're facing now are the types of evils that we visited upon indigenous people and enslaved African Americans in the Americas. Now that's not meant to demobilize us or to try to get us to give up. It's to get us to understand how the system was constructed and how we could deconstruct. But to do that, you have to get to the roots. That's why we love the term radical, right? When I say I'm a radical historian, it doesn't mean that I'm standing on top of the table, shaking my fist. I mean, you know me, I'm just not that kind of person, although I love a good labor picket line. It means that we're trying to get to the roots of the problem. Don't tell me that if I vote for Joe Biden, that the pandemic is going to go away and that we're all going to be equal. That's nonsense. Let's be realistic here. Let's try to get to the basis or to the foundation of the problems we're facing. So one of those sources would be, again, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's work on Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States.
Yeah. There's an old saying. Again, I'm messing up all these old sayings, but something like when America catches a cold, African America, Black America catches like pneumonia or something. Right? And I think that that's very true. But I also think it's true for a few other populations as well. Because when we look at the 1930s, we see the Great Depression. We see it affecting everybody. I think, all kinds of literature, Grapes of Wrath, all kinds of things come out of that. But in that same time period, when you talk about the Mexican American community, when you talk about the Chicanos, what they faced was the Mexican Repatriation Act, in which you have many people getting caught up in that. 60, like a huge percent of the population, 60% of them American born. My own family that this was caught up in the whole thing. So can you speak a little bit to how that works? I mean, how the fact that like we face these things as a national crisis, and yet within that national crisis, there are nations within the nation that are much more deeply impacted.
Matt, this is another place where you don't have to be a historian to fight this battle, but just the knowledge that you just imparted upon us. You're referring to what historians call repatriation, right? And I have family members caught up in that as well. And the reason that happened gets to what we can do now. Because one of the things we can do now is we can fight the racist scapegoating that is taking place on every street corner and every church in this country right now. What I mean by this is that, so in the 1930s, when Herbert Hoover, who probably at that point in time was the smartest white man to become president of the United States, very intelligent individual, When the Great Depression hit, within Hoover's cabinet, who was blamed first and foremost? Was Wall Street blamed? Was capitalism blamed? Was the economic system blamed? No. Who took the major blame for the Great Depression in the early months? Mexicans. And it's astonishing for my students because my students would be like, "What? You know, he did what?" Because they've heard Donald Trump make racist statements about Mexican American people, and I've said, "Wait a minute, it didn't start with Donald Trump. Go back to Herbert Hoover and even earlier." And so that was part of so-called repatriation, was racial scapegoating, was Anglo Americans looking at other people as the source of their problems. Families, again, families are looking in the mirror, failing to interrogate the system as it existed, and to realize that capitalism is all about crises. Heck, the last 25 years of the 19th century, some economic historians refer to that period of time from 1875 to 1900 as the Long Depression. There was this huge, long downturn of really of a lot of economic suffering. Capitalism always means recessions and depressions. Everyone who's alive now, everyone watching this broadcast, most of them remember the Great Recession in 2008, right? And we all knew it was only a matter of time before another recession. So instead of clear-headedly looking at why these things happen, we create scapegoats. Our leaders understand this so well. So Donald Trump is giving this speech on the coronavirus, and he strikes out the word the corona, and he replaces it with what?
China.
China. And he's a genius. He is a genius, Matt. Whenever I hear people talk about Donald Trump as being stupid, I just want to like stop them. I said, stop. When the man goes to California to make a campaign pitch in 2016, when Trump was running for president, who does he scapegoat? Chinese people. He's in Northern California. He knows where he's at, a place of historic anti-Chinese pogroms. When he's in Arizona, who does he scapegoat? Mexicans. When he's in the Midwest, who does he scapegoat? He starts talking about, oh, all those bad people in South Chicago, South Chicago, South Chicago. He doesn't even have to say black people, right? Everyone knows who he's talking about. Donald Trump is a genius of racial scapegoating. And this is where, as historically minded people, Matt, I think we have our work cut out for us. Anytime someone starts talking, and I've heard even left radical people start like dissing Chinese, China, you know, about this, blaming China and stuff. I'm like, y'all stop. Think about what you're saying. Do you really want to continue to blame our problems on people in other countries? Do you really think that the problem you're having with the opioid crisis in Florida has anything whatsoever to do with the drug situation in Venezuela? I mean, give me a break. The U.S. dispatching warships to Venezuela to fight the war on drugs? That's a political ploy. So this is where people who have a clear understanding of how the system works are so precious. We need to speak up right now. So when Trump does something like sending warships to Venezuela to fight the war on drugs, we can't let that go. When the U.S. tries to force other nations to not accept Cuban medical teams, we can't let that go. We have to call it out. Does it mean we agree with everything that's happening in Cuba? Well, no, it doesn't. There's bad things in Cuba, just like there's bad things in the U.S. But in other words, what I'm trying to get at is that when nations and people are trying to engage in acts of solidarity, we need to support those things. I don't care who it is, you know, promoting solidarity, promoting mutual aid, right? Those are the things that we need to be doing. We need to be giving people a model of what it means to be a radical or a leftist or progressive or however you define yourself. Because if you can't convince people that your way of living is going to enhance their lives, then it's going to be hard to really convince them of anything.
So, Paul, we have a question from the audience. This comes from Karina Akripais, who's a member of the Tello Jaguar team, who's written a number of articles, actually a couple that you've shared.
Yeah, great work, great writing, great writing.
And she asks, what are some ways that Chicano movement can mobilize against the consolidation of corporate power, which is taking place by the ruling class, as we recently saw with the stimulus bill?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, Grant, I think is first of all, we organize to defend our neighborhoods. Whether it's Boyle Heights in Los Angeles or Overtown in Miami, we fight gentrification. One of the things you started us off by talking about, Matt, is because number one, if we don't have neighborhoods, if we don't have communities, then we really don't have anything. So I think we start where we live. Is a neighbor having a hard time making their rent? Are they being threatened by a landlord um, for eviction? So that's like one of the first lines of defense I think that we can engage in. And then we gain a little self-confidence. I think the struggle against eviction is very important because when it's successful, and we've certainly seen this in Florida, we begin to get a better sense of self-confidence. Hey, we can do something. We can actually win. It may seem to be a one battle, but we can kind of build from there. I think the other thing is building solidarity at work. Whether or not you have a union doesn't really matter. If you're working under unsafe conditions, I think the first thing you can do is try to talk to each other. A lot of us who are working in big box stores where management is refusing to allow us to wear masks or not putting up any kind of safety gear, that's something we can organize, and that's like an everyday kind of battle that we can win. Um, and anytime we see things like that happening, Matt, we need to support those things, those activities.
Yeah,
Uh, and Americans get caught up in electoral politics, this and that. Electoral politics is important, don't get me wrong, but we often forget how important that neighborhood level activity is. And so anything we can do also to break up the isolation that too many of us face. Here's the thing I've been guilty of. I get really busy. I get wrapped up in my work. I forget to check in with my elders. That's a bad thing. And so, things like family and community are really, really important. How do we keep our communities together during this time of social distancing? So, on the one time, we're saying, hey, mom, pop, don't go to church. If you got a crazy pastor telling you to pack into your church, don't go, right? So that's cool. But how do we replace those types of activities to give people a sense of spiritual well being? So I don't want to sound mystic, Matt. I'm not a mystic person by nature, but I think finding ways to like recreate community during this time is really important.
yeah. You touch on this question of gentrification, the fight against gentrification. It's really interesting that like Boyle Heights in many ways has taken the lead. Kind of nationally. I mean, in a way that's it's really been kind of a site of like where things have really actually been able to kind of slow down a lot of things. Another example, actually, you mentioned earlier about the fighting of evictions in this moment is actually a lot of it's being launched out of El Sereno. I mean, people just keep, you see national stories being referred to as Northeast LA. Yeah, I guess, but I mean, that's El Sereno, right? Where it's
Yeah,
happening. That's actually the neighborhood I grew up in, and where most of my family still lives. So in many ways, like that little pocket of Boyle Heights. I mean, Boyle Heights and El Sereno are neighbors. I mean, you drive down Soto, they're right there next to each other. So it's kind of the same area. So it's it's very, it's very telling that out of a corner of East LA, so much of the fight of gentrification has really taken shape and given kind of an example for the rest of the country to
yeah,
really look.
yeah. Every time I can talk about Ball Heights, I was down in Miami recently, and there's a lot of connections I think that can be made between people in Miami-Dade, places like Hialeah, Overtown, Little Haiti, because they're fighting the same types of forces of gentrification that you mentioned that are going on in Southern California. And again, one of the things to think about, I think, in this moment is, you have a mayor or governor who calls for a temporary moratorium on evictions. What we should be doing as radicals is enlarging that, is to say, hey, you call for moratorium on evictions now. What about next month? The economic situation is not going to be improving for months or years. And so let's talk about a year-long moratorium on evictions. Let's talk about, extending that. And that some people may say, oh, that's incrementalism. Well, I don't care. We're always trying to create larger spaces to operate politically. And so if it means you're active in the labor movement, it means that if it means you're active in saving the postal service, if it means you're doing anti-eviction work, if it means you're fighting for national health care, and then let's not forget the struggle against U.S. imperialism. This is where I'm almost at wit's end for a certain point. I don't have the answers for this, but now is really an important time for us to call out the fact that the U.S. has ramped up sanctions against Iran, against Venezuela, against Cuba, and then to understand why that is so, and then to understand how we can build linkages of solidarity with people in those nations, and to reject this idea that you and I have some kind of enemies, in Iran, or that Venezuela is the mastermind behind the global drug trade or some kind of nonsense like that. See, this is how capital works, I believe. They work to divide and to conquer constantly. And too often we kind of fall into that, right? And Latinos, certainly I grew up in an environment. My father was the head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, actually Hispanic EEOC, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. And for him, it was an incredible job because my father went to the seventh grade. And like most Mexican men of his generation, had to drop out in Houston, Texas, to help support his family. But I remember growing up, man, hearing him talk about, he would say, when can we Hispanics get together? We're always fighting each other, the Dominicans, the Cubans, the Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, And so the struggle, that we've had for generations, continues on, But I'm excited that we're finding new ways to make connections. I mean, that's why I wrote African American and Latinx history of the United States the way I wrote it, is because I wanted to pay homage to the Haitian Revolution and how much we in Mexico owe to the Haitian Revolution. That's why I wrote about the Mexican War of Independence, because I wanted to pay homage to the fact how much people in the U.S. owe to Mexico politically and culturally. I mean, the arts, we wouldn't even be having these discussions if not for those incredible generations of Mexican public artists in the 1920s and 30s, the great muralists, the great poets, who kept alive the histories of indigenous and slave struggle, and then were imported in the United States by people like Jacob Lawrence, the WPA Project. Those are Mexican accomplishments, and so I wanted to really pay homage to those, So yeah, I mean, it all kind of fits together.
It's so fascinating that recently the New York Times and other large periodicals have taken notice, or just before the coronavirus, they took all this notice of historic impact of the Mexican muralist movement, saying, this might have actually been more important than other things. And that's just so funny to me because it was like, that's very clear and obvious, if you're not racist. It's very
Right.
it's very clear and obvious. I mean,
It's very, all you have to do
paint
is
your history on a wall,
paint your history on the wall. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, go to Mexico City, go to El Sereno, go to, Overtown. But, Christina Heatherton, my dear colleague, who teaches at the Barnard College, is on the cusp of publishing a book, which essentially talks about the same thing. Her argument, Matt, is that it's the Mexican Revolution is perhaps the most important revolution of the 20th century, and in terms of the global impact of that revolution. And when I'm in the United States, and people ask me about, how we fight imperialism, I ask them, well, have you ever read the Mexican Constitution? And people look at me blankly. And I say, if you're talking about trying to change your institutions to where they become anti-imperial, answer me this question. How many nations has Mexico bombed in the past 20 years? How many nations has Mexico invaded in the past 20, 25 years?
Yeah.
And a lot of people look at me blankly and they're like, well, none. And I'm like, well, you know what? There's a reason for that. There's a constitutional and a political history. I'm not saying Mexico is perfect, But here's the thing, Matt, we have been propagandized, even Mexican American people, I'm ashamed to say, you think that only bad things come out of Mexico. We only will talk about corruption or these terrible things. And yeah, there's a lot of problems in Mexico, but there's a lot of tremendous things we have to learn from the country right next door to us who doesn't uh, rain bombs and violence and sanctions on its neighbors the way that we do, you know. And so I just can't stand this sometimes. I hear like anytime it doesn't matter if it's the New York Times or the Progressive, anything about Mexico is bad, 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 bad. And I think we used to use that phrase internalized depression.
Mhm.
And I understand, you know, our dear colleagues in psychology kind of called us out on that. But I still think that that term has some relevance to the period that we're in. We too often question our own ability to come to grips with the problems that we face. And so we place our hopes on people like Bernie Sanders or Uncle Joe Biden or these other individuals.
Yeah.
When you know that old phrase, "We're the leaders we've been looking for," which sounds hackneyed and trite, but it's actually true. You know,
Yeah.
we have the capacity to really change this world. You know, we just have to kind of get at it.
So I want to entertain one more question, and then after that, we'll close up with. I have a question for you that's kind of dear to my heart. But a question from the audience: Paul Ortiz, can military intervention in Venezuela lead to worse conditions for the general population than they currently are?
Yes. Right now, even mainstream economists like Jeffrey Sachs, and Jeffrey Sachs is about as mainstream as you can get. Jeffrey Sachs has said that U.S. sanctions have already cost at least 40 to 50,000 lives of people in Venezuela. And to also answer that question, I would say look at Honduras, what happened after the coup in 2009. You know, again, Honduras wasn't perfect before 2009, but after the coup, things got worse and worse in terms of gang activity, in terms of street violence. And so, yes, things could get much worse in Venezuela because, number one, if the U.S. supports is successful, the U.S. is not interested in the well-being of the Venezuelan people. The U.S. His ruling class is interested in Venezuelan oil and the control of that oil, both offshore and the deposits on land. And so things could get very, very worse. They could. Uh, I would almost guarantee that within um, moments of a military invasion. I mean, one of the things that's going to happen if the U.S. tries to invade, people are going to fight back in Venezuela. I don't know. Some of my peers, some of my liberal peers, don't seem to understand this, but people in Venezuela are very well mobilized, and they will fight back. The second thing, and I mean, I'll try to be as concise about this as I can. When I was in Special Forces in the 1980s, I met a lot of people. I was actually stationed for a while in Venezuela. Was I stationed in Venezuela to bring stability and democracy to Venezuela and the special forces? Hell, heck no. All right. But equally important in Colombia, I've received a lot of communications from people in Colombia because I still have contact with people there through my military service um, who have begged me to explain to Americans that if the U.S. invades Venezuela, if the U.S. even ramps up sanctions, that it's the Colombians who are going to pay a terrible, terrible price. They're trying to work themselves out of this decades-long civil war. If the U.S. uses Colombia as a staging ground for military intervention, Colombia is going to collapse politically, socially, and likely economically. And this is one of the reasons why I ended up signing. I usually don't do this, but two elected officials in Colombia who I knew, again, going back decades, almost begged me, please sign this public statement against U.S. military intervention. Um, you know, again, we're not saying that Venezuela is perfect, but, you know, if U.S. does move to strike more assertively than now, we in Colombia are going to pay the terrible price. And the question I have is the State Department of the U.S. willing to pay that price? Yes, they are, uh, because they'll just be able to kind of watch it from afar. So yeah, things could get really worse very quickly.
Yeah. So, wrapping up now, I want to say that not only are you, a great historian, a people's historian, but you're a very particular type of historian. I mean, you are as well as the general kind of history, right? You're also an oral historian, and I want to ask you a little bit about what do you think the role of the oral historian is. It's kind of it's a multi it's multi layered question here. What is the general role of the oral historian? What is the Samuel Proctor oral history program doing in this time right now to document the stories that are coming out of this experience of this pandemic, and finally I also want to extend an invitation when this does eventually pass and you are in the LA area. The Doss Center for the Arts would love to have you host you for a book talk and come speak to certain things. And maybe even there's a possibility that the Doss Center and the Samuel Proctor Oral History program can do something together and we can gather oral histories of Mona and maybe kind of work in that way. But anyways,
Oh, we would love to do that. Matt, I was just talking with some of our students who would love to get over and be with you again. And anywhere you are, that's where we want to be. So we would love to come to Southern California and hang out. I think the role of the oral historian now is to do what we do best, which is to listen, um, to learn, and to really document people's resilience during this time of crisis. I mean, when I do an oral history with someone who works in a grocery store or a farm worker, I take my professor's cap off. I leave it in my closet where it belongs. And I go out and I learn. And then we do what we can, we do what you're doing, Matt, which is to rebroadcast these stories of struggle. You do it through poetry, through your lectures, through your workshops. Oral historians, do it through, blogs, through podcasts, through writing pieces. But I think it's all about trying to tell stories of people who have been submerged by the system. And I think no time is better than now to talk about the struggles of ordinary people. And to me, in my oral history seminar, actually the last book we read was a book called They Say in Harlan County by the great Italian oral historian Alessandro Portelli. And Portelli, when he came to this country in the 60s, he could barely speak a word of English. And among the first people he interviewed were these radical striking coal miners in Harlan County, Kentucky. And he said he was shocked because he said growing up in Italy and in Europe, he said we were told the United States has no class conflict, that race relations were really getting much better and everyone got along. He was stunned to find out that in Harlan County people were getting shot and gunned down for trying to organize a union. And so he's a person I think of as one of my role models, as a person who kind of busts stereotypes, not by being smarter and coming up with some kind of original philosophical intervention, but by like talking to ordinary people, talking to coal miners, talking to grocery store workers in Southern California, agricultural workers, postal workers. How many people, how often do you turn on the radio and hear in interviews, sustained interviews with people who work inside of a warehouse, a UPS warehouse, an Amazon warehouse, a postal warehouse? Those are the voices I think we need to really highlight now as oral historians, as poets, as painters, as writers, and again, let's learn from our ancestors of the great Mexican muralist tradition. Uh, uh, I'll ask you a question, Matt. How are wealthy people depicted in the great Mexican murals of the 1930s?
not well, and much to the chagrin of Henry Ford.
They're not our, yeah, they're not our saviors, right? They're not the
Right, right.
what did Eugene Debs say? I wouldn't be your savior because if I could, I forget the phrase. It was pithy. It was like, if you chose me to lead you out of the wilderness, then I could just easily lead you back into it, right?
Yeah,
And Debs was making a point. Don't pick these leaders. Organize amongst yourselves. Draw on your own capacities. As
yeah.
communities.
Yeah, well, how did that song go? They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, there'd be a Union man or a thug for.
J.H. Blair, yeah, who's the sheriff, right? And there
Right.
was another great song, Matt, that Bertelli talks about where a coal mining, a woman whose uh, husband was a miner, wrote a song that had a line that said, "Down with the capitalist system." She was not a Marxist; she never read Marx. But when the song was introduced outside of Harlan County to liberal audiences, she was asked to change the line from "Down with the capitalist system" to "Down with the bosses," because ordinary working class people are not supposed to know anything about capitalism, right? So, but again, our role, I think, as oral historians, is to tell the truth. I mean, do it. Uh, if we can't do it now, we'll never be able to do it.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you. And we talk about those great frescoes by you know um by Siqueiros and Rivera and many others. It's just really incredible work, and on the work and the work that is carried on um, here in LA. With Judy Baca and
Yeah.
Frank Romero and so many other wonderful muralists. It's really a great legacy that you see people tapping into and being a part of. And as an artist myself, I'm very honored to play some small, hit, tap the wall somehow. So, um, I really want to thank you for joining us, Paul. This has been a wonderful hour spent. I know I won't forget it anytime soon, and I really appreciate you. The Dawson Center of the Arts really appreciates you coming in and doing this, and we're hoping to do more in the future and continue these conversations. And um, can you tell our audience where they can find your work and maybe some book recommendations outside of your
Yeah.
own?
Well, yeah. I mean, we talked about African American and Latinx history of the United States, and folks can either buy the book at Beacon Press. Please try to buy it through your local bookstore if you can. I know it's a hard time. But also that book is available as an audiobook, and I'm available to do workshops. I've done these all across the country, in fact, in different parts of the world around that book. I also wrote a book called Emancipation Betrayed, which is about the Black freedom struggle before the Jim Crow period, which I think has a lot of important connections now. Um, I think, other books, I mean, I just kind of go back to Rudy's, Occupied America. I mean, I think it's such an important book to really get a great overview of U.S. history, internalized oppression. Um, Other books, I always tell people, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States really saved my life, because when I got out of the military, I was very cynical, very angry, very upset. Someone put that book in my hands, and I realized, what a good history could do in terms of not just being cynical about how corrupt American history is, because this is a corrupt country, uh, but in Zinn's uh, telling of the story, there's possibilities of radical insurgency, radical insurrection, right? And so that's very, very important. Another good movement book, Charles Payne's I've Got the Light of Freedom on the Mississippi Freedom Movement in the 1950s and 1960s. I've Got the Light of Freedom is a really good kind of blow by blow account of how very impoverished, very poor people organized to challenge, the system. I think it's a very important, um, book. And there's so many others. Matt, terrible question as to historian because we'll be here all day, man.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank everyone who's tuned in today. We're going to continue this web series, the Dawson Center for Arts. I want to thank Margaret Cheel, our executive director, for setting up the Zoom account. And we're really looking forward to speaking to so many others. We're so honored to have spoken with you today, and just to the audience out there. Um, just because we're locked in doesn't mean we have to be locked out, and physical distance, not social distance. So let's keep talking.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Paul.